off with land acknowledgements. Um, as we gather here today, we honor, acknowledge, and ask you to remember that we are on the traditional terrorists and ancestral homeland of multiple Native American tribes, such as the Pueblos, Apache, and the Navajo nations. We pay our respects and give thanks to those tribal nations and the ancestors of this place, and reaffirm our relationship with one another.
Martin Luther King had a quote that talked about, and I'm going to paraphrase it, the arc of the world universe being long, but that it always ends for justice. People ask, have we as African Americans arrived? No, there's good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff on the NewsHour tonight. Chaos at the Capitol. A mob supporting and encouraged by President Trump stormed the U.S. Capitol, breaking windows, pushing through police with shots fired inside as lawmakers were gathered to count the votes, confirming President-elect Biden won the election. A disturbing scene the country has never witnessed. We devote the entire program to this moment and talk to one of the winners from the Georgia Senate race.
Again, good afternoon. My name is Natalia Walton. I am the Graduate Assistant Coordinator for the Center for Identity and Inclusion at CU Denver. In the wake of racial terrorism that occurred at the Capitol on June 6th, we will be discussing the Black historical electoral politics, or the Black historical arc. With limited time, we ask you to place all your questions in the chat. If your question is not addressed, please email cii@cudenver.edu, and we will filter the questions to the respective panelists and return your response. I want everyone to remember that this is a safe space that we are in, and we're talking about historical Black electoral politics, and this is a very sensitive subject. We ask that you honor this space and everyone in it with kindness, open-mindedness, and allow yourself to absorb, learn, and reflect. This topic and the panelists, they are very passionate about, and emotions may rise as we discuss politics, racial injustice, and the Black community. I would like to introduce our panelists. Dr. Stark is an assistant professor in the Public Affairs of the University of Colorado, Denver. His research includes specific interests in vulnerable and traditionally marginalized populations, public service education, and liberation. Prior to coming to CU Denver, Dr. Stark worked as a human service practitioner, engaging with public and private service providers. He's a native of Virginia. He received his bachelor's degree in clinical psychology and human services at the Old Dominion University. He received his master's at Virginia Commonwealth University and his PhD at the University of Nebraska. We won't hold that against you, Dr. Stark. Most recently, Dr. Stark received the NASPAA Social Justice Curriculum and ASPA Social Justice Dissertation Award. I'd next like to introduce Dr. Devin Wright. Dr. Devin Wright holds a PhD in sociology from Florida International University Global Sociocultural Studies Program. He's an assistant professor at the Africana Studies Department at Metropolitan State University of Denver. He teaches various courses, including Introduction to Africana Studies, Social Movements and the Black Experience, the Black Community, Politics and Black People, Hip Hop Culture, and Rap. And he recently created courses called Black Lives Matter and the COVID-19 pandemic. His research interests focus on racism and controversial right-wing social movement organizations, particularly white supremacist ideology and racist rhetoric. I'm going to also introduce Dr. Sampson. Dr. Sampson has maintained a space of social justice and cultural humility, and she works across the business, education, and social worker fields as an administrator, a leader, and a equity specialist. Dr. Sampson is a licensed clinical social worker, has a master's degree in social work, and has earned a PhD in educational leadership with emphasis on cultural response pedagogy. I will not be your host. I am just the introductor. Um, our host today is Dr. Antoine Jefferson. Dr. Jefferson.
Thank you, Natalia. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Antoine Jefferson. I'm an associate professor in the clinical teaching track in the School of Education and Human Development at CU Denver. I can tell you more about my background. If you're interested, we could do that over coffee later. Today, I'm here to sort of facilitate a conversation between three tremendous scholars who all happen to identify as Black or African American, who have developed some information to share with us today. They'll be making some presentations. So here's how this will go. I'm going to ask Dr. Wright to get us started, and each of the panelists has been asked to create, let's say, a 5 to 7 minute presentation in particular. So I, as well as the rest of you, will mostly be in a passive role, sort of listening, but I want to encourage you to be learning and reflecting along the way. And then we'll hear from Drs. Stark and Sampson, respectively. At the end of this conversation, while they're making presentations to us, I will be making some notes. I want to encourage you to make some notes. And then I will ask them some questions that I will have prepared. Ideally, as a result of this 1 hour time this afternoon, we will do a couple of things. One is honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other freedom fighters who've been participating in the Black struggle for freedom and justice, which is the international struggle for freedom and justice around the world, or at least closely connected. We should also be engaged in some reflection about what are we learning about the institutions that maintain injustice and marginalization. Not only how can we remain aware, but how might we be participating in holding up these systems that are historically marginalized or marginalizing? Because the goal of the day is not just to be passive recipients of information, check something off of our boxes. There are other opportunities that will be happening in this next 50 or so minutes, including challenging our own conceptions of what justice means, what freedom is, what liberation is, what is the struggle, what's the role of Black electoral politics, and what are some of the contradictions embedded in the role of Black elected officials in US public policy. So I want to encourage you to listen, but listen attentively and also self-reflect. I will be asking the panelists after they make their presentations some questions that will be good for the group, I hope. And then for others of you who have some questions, as was already indicated by Natalia in that wonderful introduction, put your questions in the chat. We won't get to them all because time is not on our side in that sense. But we will try and do a nice job of reading through the questions, finding some that are in common and asking those. And then we'll run out of time because how much time can we spend reflecting on 160 years of work to freedom following the emancipation of enslaved Africans and their descendants? So we can only do so much in this hour. But I do want to encourage you to be focused. This will be a really exciting time. And so I want to thank you all for your attendance today and ask Dr. Wright, why don't you get us started?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me on this panel. I'm pleased to serve alongside such esteemed individuals. So to begin, I wanted to sort of take us through, very briefly, the long history of Black electoral politics, formal Black electoral politics, because there's an aspect of Black politics that preceded the Reconstruction, which is where I'm going to begin, right? Politics is not just voting, it's not just serving in office. Politics is a way of life, really. But to begin in the Reconstruction, first of all, what was the Reconstruction? It was the post-Civil War period between the years 1865 and 1877, in which you have the first Black politicians serving in the US Congress. It's a period that begins with awesome hope and promise for a new expanding meaning of American democracy, where racial exclusions are removed from electoral participation, and holding political office and political representation. Reconstruction was focused on reconstituting the Union, which had been fractured by the Civil War. It was focused on reconfiguring a new political order that incorporated Black men, the majority of which had been slaves before the war, and dealing with the traitorous rebellion, which produced the Confederate States of America, of course. Through the efforts of the Republican Party, particularly the so-called radical Republicans who pushed for political, social, and economic racial equality, the right to vote is expanded to all men, regardless of race and property qualifications. This is known as universal manhood suffrage. Of course, as radical as it was at the time, these privileges and rights were not expanded to women yet. That comes with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Key legislative achievements that expanded Black political rights include the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery, at least on paper. The 14th Amendment compelled states to recognize the citizenship rights of its state residents. States could not pass laws violating these constitutional rights, and it created automatic birthright citizenship. And the 15th Amendment, which defined the right to vote as one that cannot be taken away on account of race, color, previous condition of servitude. However, after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, you have coming into the presidency, Andrew Johnson, who initially made grandiose promises to Black people. He decided to go against the legislative agenda of the Republican-controlled Congress and vetoed much of what had been passed out of both houses, which Johnson later becomes the first president in US history to be impeached, but escaped removal from office, of course. No president has been removed from office yet as a result of impeachment. His resistance to the expansion of democracy to the former slaves was a signal of things to come in the South. Because although the Reconstruction began as an era of hope and promise for a new American democracy, it tragically ended in the same way the US Constitution itself was created, at the expense of Black people. Just as the framers of the Constitution created a new government by allowing the slaveholding class to maintain their political and economic power on the back of subservient Black laborers, so too did the North and the South come to an agreement in the Compromise of 1877 that Union troops would be removed out of the South and Black people would live under white supremacist state government rule. Also, the North and the Republicans grew tired of seriously pursuing a political agenda that meant white Southerners would have to actually share political, social, and economic power with Black people. They weren't going to do that. In fact, white violent resistance became the effective method by which Black political power would be eliminated. Similar to what the United States had to deal with after it invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, toppling the regimes there and attempting to install a new political order, so too did the Union. Although it decisively defeated the Confederacy, so too did the Union have to deal with a military insurgency movement aimed at creating political instability through acts of terror. This took the form not only of the KKK and other similar groups, but through white mob violence. I don't want to get too much into the details of all this just yet, but this is a theme that many of the panelists will be discussing and hint to. But I do want to say that the pervasive belief that Black people commit the most crimes is a racist notion that completely ignores the long, brutally violent history of the criminality of white supremacist terrorist groups, white mob violence, that in the 20th century destroyed entire Black towns across the country and produced the sacrificing of Black bodies to the gods of white supremacy in the brutal, murderous ritualism of lynching. So white terrorism, often in cooperation with local law enforcement, embraced a method of systematic violence not different from what some typically associate with Islamic radical extremists, which had the effect of eliminating Black political power throughout much of the 20th century. And to comment on the first half of the 20th century, the Jim Crow segregation era, of course, came to dominate Black life. It reduced to virtual agricultural slave laborers, Black people, not much different than before the Civil War, in the form of the sharecropping system, convict lease labor, peonage laws, the grandfather clauses, the Black codes. They all operated to annihilate the political rights Black people had acquired during Reconstruction. However, Black people still persevered and pushed for greater inclusion in American democracy. In fact, the early 20th century saw a debate within Black America about the best way forward despite the rise of white supremacy. This came in the form, most notably, of Booker T. Washington's approach by way of conciliation and accommodation and methodology of working within the system, or at least not challenging it through pragmatism, through his Tuskegee Institute. Then you had his detractor, W.E.B. Du Bois. His approach was, his philosophy, I should say first, was racial justice, racial equality, a demand for it now. His methodology was working within the system by reforming it and challenging it directly through activism and through the leadership of the so-called Talented 10th. And the oldest civil rights American organization was created almost single-handedly by Du Bois, the NAACP. And then you have the voice of somewhat of an outsider, Jamaican by birth, my people, by the way, Marcus Garvey, whose philosophy was Black nationalism, racial separatism, the methodology of racial separatism through a repatriation back to Africa, and his organization, the United Negro Improvement Association. And this kind of takes us to the modern civil rights era. I would say Du Bois's approach to confronting white supremacy head on through activism became the dominant mode of Black protest politics in the post-World War II civil rights era, which embraced a method of civil disobedience, non-cooperation, non-violence, the strategy of lawsuits, boycotts, marches, sit-ins, other demonstrations, all aimed at the goal of racial equality through racial integration and expanding and protecting the Black vote. I should backtrack just a bit and say that it is by the post-World War II civil rights era that you see the shift in the Black vote away from the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, to the Democratic Party, the party of FDR, JFK, LBJ, not LeBron James, but Lyndon Baines Johnson, who pushed for racial equality, which caused the Democratic Party to lose most of its white voters who were committed to the idea of denying Black people the right to vote. They found a new and more comfy home in the Republican Party under Nixon, who embraced his, quote, law and order strategy, and Reagan, who embraced the Southern strategy and used perhaps a softer racist appeal to white voters who despised the idea of sharing political power with Black people. Just to end it, because that takes us to the modern era, takes us to the 1980s, 1990s, up to the present, that the current order that we live in is defined by so-called racial identity politics. And you saw it play out on the Capitol a couple of weeks ago, which we can get into if there's more time after the other presenters do their thing. So thank you very much for that.
Dr. Wright, thank you very much. For those of you who are listening, here are two things that I really want to strongly encourage you to be thinking about. The first is, what new information did you just learn from Dr. Wright? Now, I'm not asking you to respond verbally, obviously, but I do want you to think about, well, what is new? And my assumption, my guess is for many of us in this conversation today, quite a bit of that was new, which leads to the second question. Why are we not, as students in the education system in particular, not just higher education affiliated, but in our pre-K through 12th grade public system, why are children not learning this information at this depth? Now, if Dr. Wright can give an overview in 7 or 8 minutes, which he did masterfully, what does that indicate to you about some of the flaws in our larger social system in which our children are not learning this in depth and not just at MLK weekend in school? Now, I want to ask Dr. Anthony Stark, who's from Virginia, which is a fascinating place. It's also where I'm from. to help narrow our focus a little bit, to talk about like public policy and the role of government and other things that will come up. And then we'll continue the conversation. Dr. Wright, thank you. Dr. Stark, really happy to hear from you, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Dr. Jefferson, and thank you, Dr. Wright, for that that beautiful, concise, and elaborate chronicle of Black electoral politics. And what I will say is that I want to begin by kind of just sharing a brief bit about who I am and the way that I frame public policy in my approach. And I'll try to keep it very brief. So by and large, as someone who does not have a traditional political science background, but who is very much so entrenched in public policy and the work of public affairs and public administration, when I came to this field, from my background in human services, where I was fortunate enough to work with different populations from all walks of life. One of the things that I quickly encountered is that the discipline of public administration, the discipline of public policy, the discipline of political science was not created in the image of those individuals who I had the immense pleasure of working with, and recognizing the ways in which our public institutions and our democratic institutions have crippled, so to speak, their way of life. And so one of the ways that I approach public policy and policy analysis that is very, I would say, postmodern when compared to what we traditionally think of public policy. When I work with students who are very new to this work, we think policy begins and ends with legislation, with what the Congress is doing. But there's so much more that begins well before that, and so much more that continues well after that in terms of policy implementation. And so as we look at policy design, and as we look at the ways in which we as a collective work together to solve social issues, I am very much so intrigued with how we frame these problems and the stories that we tell to help us make sense of problems and solutions. And what is most telling, I think, about the Black electoral experience really comes from our understanding, as Dr. Jefferson just kind of laid out for us, our understanding of the work of Martin Luther King, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his colleagues, such as my distinguished fraternity brother, Ralph Abernathy. But with that being said, one of the things that I think we tend to overlook when we talk about his "I Have a Dream" speech and all of the wonderful things that Dr. King has done is the context in which that speech had taken place. That speech occurred at the 1960, I'm terrible with dates off the top of my head. I'm going to say 1963. I could be mistaken, but the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And so what does this mean for Dr. King? When we really begin to explicate some of his later orations and his speeches that he gives, we find out that economic equality really is a driver, as he sees it, for civil rights, that there can be no racial equality without economic equality, and there can be no civil rights without racial equality. So first and foremost, we need to begin with addressing these issues. As a scholar of public administration, one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to get a better understanding of how we began to address the issue of poverty in the United States. And what I learned after a review of our long and storied history of social policy is that changes in anti-poverty policies have not redressed poverty. Poverty still exists, and the inequality gap continues to widen. Rather, what has happened is we have reformed our conceptions of policy. We begin to tell different stories about the origins of policy. We begin to create these different myths and these different ideas about the causes of poverty, the ways that we should address these issues, those who are impoverished. And so over time, what happens in the policy setting is that we're not necessarily dealing with just facts and figures, as many policy analysts will tell you. You can't just simply do a cost-benefit analysis to understand poverty. You really have to understand the stories that are told within these discussions that are being had by decision makers, the ways in which they are receiving and really kind of embodying that information to make those decisions. And what we find out is that they are very much so, these stories in public policy as Dr. Wright had kind of given us this overlay, we see that along with each of those changes in policies and each of those changes in legislation, there are these myths that are very much so indebted to a long history of white supremacy in terms of how we view those who are the target populations, those who are intended to be impacted by our public policies. I will wrap it up here by just basically briefly saying that King, in his I Have a Dream speech, he presents a moral dilemma. For us, one of the things that I appreciate about Dr. King's approach, and I appreciate many of his other contemporaries, such as Malcolm X, even Marcus Garvey, who may not be considered his contemporary in terms of them being alive and working at the exact same time, but very much so being from the same, I would say, Black experience. That Dr. King really does a great job of pointing out the irony in our national ethos. He says that either the nation must come to terms with the fact that its practices are in stark opposition to its current policies and economic structure, or changes need to be made to align the two. And one of the things that he talks about is how is it possible that in America, the land of milk and honey, the land of dreams, that people are working for starvation wages. And so what I'm hoping that we can do and what I can bring to this discussion and that you all can take away from this discussion is as we engage in public policy, even today, when we look at what's happening in the world, think about what are the different stories that you've been hearing and where are those stories coming from, where are their origins, where are they gaining traction from, who are the narrators, who are the individuals who are perpetuating these myths, so to speak. And so I'll stop there and I look forward to our discussion moving forward.
Dr. Stark, that was also beautiful. I'm glad I'm not on the panel because I would have to keep up with this brilliance. But let me encourage this audience of listeners to maybe even make a more detailed, particular connection to Dr. Stark's comments about the role of narrative and storytelling in informing public policy. As many of you hopefully know, I'm sure you learned this in your pre-K through 12th grade education. Ronald Reagan used to be president of the US. He only won his second time running. He lost his first bid. And one of the most important tools that Ronald Reagan used to win his bid for president is when he actually won the presidency, was in telling the story of a Black woman named Linda Turner, who became widely known as the welfare queen. And the story about her, which still continues today, we've heard glimpses of it from William Jefferson Clinton, for instance, and even more recently. But the stories about this Black woman she was indicative of the problems with using public policy to cure for poverty, because the narrative was the more resources she received from the government, the more fur coats she owned and the more Cadillacs she purchased. And that wasn't true historically, but it was a very effective narrative against Black people and their liberation and economic freedom, to use her as an indicator of what the problems were in using public policy to give people the resources they needed to survive. And I imagine that if any of you has taken the time to just do a Google search, welfare queen, you'll see caricatures, you'll see photographs, and you'll read stories of how problematic this Black woman was and why she's a reason that public policy has not been used to cure for poverty, but as Dr. Stark mentioned, instead, other things we see consequentially. And I just want to make that connection for you all, that narrative is effective, and the way that people vote sometimes follows the narratives that we're fed, because they're not rooted in our own truths. They're handed to us by others who are using the Black experience as a weapon against Black liberation. But let's transition one more time. So our third panelist, Dr. Sampson, will help us understand a little bit more about the importance of the Black struggle for freedom and liberation, with a focus on how do we take care of ourselves and what's the purpose of things like mental health. So Dr. Sampson, looking forward to your comments today.
Thank you. I'm really just riding the backs of my panelists who have provided such a great foundation. I want to go to how we're feeling as Black folks. There's no monolithic experience, but I'm mad and I'm hurt. And systemic racism must be identified as a public health crisis. And I don't think we've looked at that in terms of the amount of support that we have not received as Black folks, a long history. I didn't get no mule, no reparations, no money for student loans. Nobody has provided the kind of economic assistance that Black folks have deserved in their contributions to this country. So I'm just going to come straight at it today to talk about why systemic racism is a health crisis. And we are not a divided country. I'm tired of people talking about that. In my division, it's half and half. There ain't no division right now in being a divided country. We are lucky to be a quarter and a third. And as we think about this work that we have to do, it's not division in terms of being divided. It is total inequity across systems of education, economics, housing, and health. There's just so many areas. So I'm gonna try not to preach today, but I'm going to be real clear about where we are as a country and think about some of the things we can do. Even with all of what I will say in the next few minutes, I still have hope. Because when you're hopeless, you're self-destructive. You don't care. You don't reach out. You don't continue to bring forth all of your skills and abilities. And you don't reach out to others that can be really accomplices in this work. And I go back to our ancestors. I count on them and what they have said. I go back to my mother who said, if you can look up, girl, you better get up. And so as we start to talk about these issues today, I want us to understand that we have the ability to move to other spaces, but we better be strong about what we have to look at. So I want to center the experiences of Black folks today and beyond. And so here's some of my truths. They don't have to be yours because I said we are not a monolithic group, but these are some of mine, is that I'm traumatized and I'm angry. And every time I have to assert my humanity, and every time I must declare unrecognized atrocities, that is an assault to my being. And as we think about acknowledging and healing generational racialized trauma, we've got to look at it as a systemic issue, that it is a health crisis. It's similar to a emotional psychological pandemic. We don't talk about it enough. And I can't even talk about the Black electorate without talking about Black healthcare, Black education, Black economics, and Black decarceration. Now, that would take the rest of 2021. So I'm gonna try to be brief and just get to some specific areas. Black folks ain't the saviors. I didn't say aren't. I said they ain't the saviors of the world. And we are tired. So where I'm coming from today is I still have that hope, and it's across, around, and up and through me. But I also am being really clear about what we've seen, what we've experienced, and the harm that it causes. So if you take a look at this visual that I'm presenting today, I'm about to make this visual a mess because we are in a mess. And you may see 3 beautiful interlocking circles, but they represent the magnitude of areas. And that's not even adding decarceration, economics, and the pandemic. A lot of these areas are intersectional. But we can't be afraid to ask for what we need anymore. And this current tide could turn back. I have so many people asking for support and training and our DEI, race, diversity, equity, inclusion work, which is a focus that I have. However, when I say it takes at least a year for us to anchor this and build the infrastructure and get ready, what do you think I have heard? People don't want to do the work. So as the restaurants open, you can take your kids out to whatever you want to do, relationships, or you don't have to look at each other every day. What's going to happen after that? What will happen to the world? So we can't keep begging for our humanity. It's abusive and traumatic. And Black mental health wellness is so important. So we're going to start with Black mental health wellness, and that includes health and mental health. We sometimes will not say what is happening to us because we don't know who are our accomplices and who cares for us as we walk the earth every day in our shoes. So we have to understand that the forms of spirituality and the forms of social justice that we have used before in regard to our mental wellness are not necessarily there. Even the rituals of saying goodbye to people when they have passed away is all different now. There are specific ways that we've done that. And many of these rituals are gone. We're looking at each other on Zoom. Nobody want to do that. We have to do that. We are communal folks. We like to talk together, look in each other's eyes. And a lot of these things have changes, and this has also impaired our mental wellness, the ability to engage in ritualized practices. So I want to say that it's not just how we act, but we've got to engage in ways that talk about our experiences, like the work of Dr. Joy DeGruy, post-traumatic slave syndrome. Nobody want to talk about it. What happened? What was brought all the way across the ocean to now? Dr. DeGruy has even had death threats about proposing that philosophical space. What happens to us when in our generational history, trauma is centered? It's still there. It changes the brain. It changes how we feel. So we've got to acknowledge the hurt and the harm and what it does to us. In terms of Black political power, well, first of all, the sisters ain't playing. Now, we did bring it and we did all kinds of stuff, but we ain't the saviors of the world. We've got to blend the old and the new together. I'm so proud of the young folks who have jumped out there, Black, Indigenous, all people of color, what they have done to bring this to the forefront. And I'm proud of our white allies who have stood in the gap for us. But we got to blend the old and the new. Young folks are the fire right now, but we must insist that in Black political power, that we have funding for racialized trauma, because it's real. We need money, support, people of color who have culture responsive therapeutic stances, white folks who are willing to learn that and understand what it means and ask about it and not be afraid to hear the real answers and the trauma that has come forth. And we need to stop giving our votes for nothing in return. So we got a $1.9 trillion plan that Biden and Harris have coming up with, but where is it going to be and who's going to get it and what's going to happen? Right now, we are sitting in Denver, Colorado, with already more white folks receiving the vaccine than Black and brown communities who are disproportionately overrepresented in being COVID positive and in deaths. It's still continuing. What are we going to do to reboot that? And then as we center the experiences of Black students and youth in schools, they've already told you what they need. They've told you in the history. They've told you in the research. We still are not doing it. They say we got to hear more about ourselves. We've got to understand that pedagogy is emancipatory. You can't come teach in our community, run out at 4 o'clock and don't know nothing about our communities or about our real authentic lives. These are important components. I have seen educators act like the students are theirs, like an object, when they are of the world, they are of the community. And so we have to pay attention to what our students are saying. They're asking for this. White students are asking for that. Asian students are asking. When we all know each other, we do better. There's more empathy. And so we got to pay attention to what our youth and students are asking for, and they're asking not to be isolated and how we reach out to them. And then we've got to honor our families and children. If you're going to look at social justice across multiple systems, oppressive systems, then we have to make a commitment to Black families, youth, and children in a different way and say the words, label the words, talk them through. Finally, where are you on the social action continuum? Are you just talking? Do you have a sign up in your window? Did you help go downtown and talk to others? Or are you actually dismantling oppression in your spaces with family and friends, with that uncle that talks disrespectfully about Black folks or LGBTQ folks? Or what are you doing in your spaces? Because it doesn't stop. It doesn't just happen on Martin Luther King Day, Rosa Parks afternoon, Day of the Dead assembly. What is the work that is going to happen? And where are you on the continuum? Be truthful about where you fall. Are you recognizing? Are you into action? What are you doing as an ally? And then examine yourself. If the murder of George Floyd finally pushed you to act, as those feelings can subside. Oh, that was so awful. We saw him die inside multiple times for what we see of the mirror of who we are. And it is a privilege to look at something like that and say, oh, I must do something. I need to read a book, when we are walking the earth and being challenged every day. So I really want to push you to think about where you're falling, because we don't want no performative social justice. This is my neighbor's sign. We believe Black Lives Matter, love is love. The man has never spoken to me one time. So when we do performative stuff, it looks beautiful, but it doesn't change oppression in every system that we are in. I can't even, this is too much. I tell you, this visual, I'm just gonna let you look at it, because it's gonna tell you from the beginning to the end, how do you build that infrastructure in yourself and in your spaces? What are you going to do at the very bottom, which is your brick, to build the space so that you can talk, label, dismantle. Who am I? Why do I care? Your systemic work. What oppressive systems do I maintain? Because we're always talking, oh, we've excluded people, they're marginalized. No, they've been historically excluded. That's what they've been. So do I intellectualize and minimize or seek to dismantle? Ask yourself the questions in the blue box. What do I know about people's experiences? How am I embedding the consciousness? How have I otherized and minoritized? So we really want to pay attention. If we're going to really do equity and not equality, giving everybody the same thing, don't care if it fits or not, how are you going to do that in yourself and external to yourself in every setting? And that's my charge to you, is what is your commitment?
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Sampson. I presume that you all heard the same content that I heard. And I want to ask you to begin thinking about the questions that you have. But let me point out one of the current contradictions that seem to be important to mention in this conversation. One of Dr. Sampson's slides indicated that we need funding for racialized trauma. And I just want to acknowledge that this question of Black people needing governmental funding to accomplish Black people's hopes and dreams for freedom and equal opportunity and social and political and economic equity highlights the same sort of issue, Dr. Sampson, you pointed out, the $1.9 trillion funding packet for COVID relief. For some of you on this call, if you're like me and my family members, you might be checking your account every day for this COVID response stimulus check, whatever amount it's going to be. Let me say that we should think about that as the people's money. That money comes from taxpayer dollars. Maybe many of us on this call have contributed to, and we're just asking for some of our money back so that we can sustain ourselves. And in this case, when Dr. Sampson's slide mentioned that we need funding for racialized trauma, that is not a request for a handout. That is a request to return funds generated by Black, Indigenous, Brown, and other people's forced and undercompensated labor to return to their communities to support their stabilization. These are not requests for handouts. This is how justice is supposed to happen. So I want to, as Natalia pointed out, ask you all, if you have questions for this group, you should put them in the chat. We have 12 minutes and we're going to finish on time, because this is not the Black church right now. It was a little while, but it's not the Black church right now. We got to finish on time. So here are a couple of things I want to ask these panelists to comment on. Maybe Dr. Wright, because you provided an overarching historical sort of frame. How would you answer this question? If people say we're in a movement now, that Black Lives Matter is a current movement? How do we know that it's a movement, given your knowledge of sort of history, including the historical Black struggle for freedom and justice and liberation? How would you frame the way that we should be thinking about what's happening in our society today as indicative of a very important movement that we should all be paying attention to?
So to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement is to talk about people's growing awareness of things that Black people have been complaining about in this country for generations, but have been not taken seriously about. And that is the routine occurrence of police brutality, right? Now, let me just give a little bit of positionality here. I'm actually an immigrant. I'm actually a Black immigrant. I was born in Canada. I came to this country in 1988. And I will say, unfortunately, in the minds of a lot of Black immigrants, even in the minds of Black immigrants, there's a dismissal of claims by Black people who grew up in this country about police brutality. So I remember growing up in the 80s and in the 90s and, not really taking this stuff seriously until what woke me up was the 1992 Rodney King beating videotape. And I remember how I felt at the time. I said, there's no way that this can be dismissed. The evidence is right there. Foolish me for thinking that. Cops were acquitted, LA riots, history. So fast forward to the 21st century, the killing, I'm not going to use that word, the murder of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman. Although the act itself was not caught on videotape, there was audio tape, and there was dispute about whose voice was calling for help. There was, if you remember correctly, in the media, a certain amount of demonizing of the image of Trayvon Martin as a thug in the making, right? Images of him taking pictures of himself with gold teeth. And so this is supposed to represent a stereotypical image of, a young thug in the making. And therefore, by implication, he deserved to die. He got what he deserved. And then you have the emergence of the hashtag Black Lives Matter by the 3 Black women founders of the term Black Lives Matter, which later became a movement, which flared up in the 2014 summer protests in Ferguson, right? Baltimore, and so forth, over Freddie Gray. And I mean, it's just too many names to mention. I remember, again, going back to my feelings about Rodney King and the acquittal of the officers there, I remember feeling the same after seeing the video footage of Philando Castile getting shot, his daughter in the back, his girlfriend next to him, him and his girlfriend still having the presence of mind to be deferential and polite to the police officer as his life is leaving him, right? And there's plenty of historical parallels between what we've recently seen in the last 10 or so years and the civil rights era that I talked about earlier. Many people draw a parallel between the murder of Trayvon Martin and the lynching of Emmett Till, okay? And so how do you know, to answer your question, how do you know when you're in a movement that is now called Black Lives Matter? You can identify the parallels. You can pay attention to the obviousness of the protests that have been happening again since 2013, 2014, just about every year, right? And the explosion of protests, it became an international movement after the tragic murder of George Floyd in May, which I'm gonna be honest, as a person who has studied police brutality and white supremacist mob terrorism, Black protests, I myself was taken aback. I was surprised at the huge explosion of protests across the nation and in the UK and in other places, right? Black Lives Matter left the United States and became an international slogan, an international movement, in contrast to what conservative right-wing media would have us believe about Black Lives Matter, that it's socialist inspired, Antifa driven, just about senseless violence. And then, right, what do we get to contrast the years of demonizing of Black Lives Matter as this inherently thuggish, riotous movement? We get what happened on January 6, 2021, which I'll leave it there, and I'll let my other co-panelists speak to that.
I think I'm just going to ask your other panelists another question. I think, I think that question from X is maybe where we'll end about next steps and actions. So I want to ask Dr. Stark a question that I think is reminiscent, Dr. Stark, of your comment about narrative and public policy. One of the phenomena that I try to help my students understand in my own sort of teaching and scholarship is this notion of social construction, that the agreements that we live according to are agreements. They're not ultimate truths, capital T, right? Like, and even when it comes to policy, maybe there are some social constructions at play. Can you help us understand how, even in the work of developing public policy that's supposed to be for the greater good of all persons who participate in a social system, what's the role of like the social construction of identities as it relates to prioritizing public policy and government work?
Thank you for that question, and it was such a good question. Because we're quarantining, I have on a blazer and a button-up shirt, but I have on shorts under this, so I had to kick my Crocs off because it's just that great of a question that I had to get into it. But no, I think that you are absolutely right. And one of the things that I wanted to mention very briefly, and I want to thank Dr. Sampson for what she said and what she has done for us in this moment as a qualified mental health professional. On what's today, January 19, 2021. I have yet to see the video footage of the murder of George Floyd. It is too traumatic for me. It is something that I don't need to allow that into my being to understand the importance of this moment, to understand the brevity of what's happening to Black and Brown folks. And what I will say to tie this to your question is I think that it's important that we begin to change the narratives, that we begin to ask different questions, that we begin to see people for who they are, that we begin to divest from these ideas. One of the things that really frustrates me as a practitioner and as a scholar of public affairs is that we have, as a society, we've created these institutions. And for some reason, we have this fear of refurbishing them or letting them go and rebuilding them. And so one of the things that I'm struggling with, even in my own research now, as I am trying to catch up to Dr. Wright and reading a lot of the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and looking at Reconstruction and understanding these things, is I never can wrap my mind around why it is that we couldn't let go of capitalism, why it is that we couldn't let go of some of these systems and really begin to rebuild from the bottom up. One of the important things about social constructions is, yes, it is an idea. It's a shared idea. It's this thing that we create together, but it's a verb, it's an action. It's something that we are constantly creating and reifying and recreating. And so every day that we wake up and we say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, or we do whatever it is that we do to make these ideas real, we do it all the time. And it's not just ideas about public institutions, it's ideas about people who are like us and people who are not like us. One of the reasons why I studied welfare policy in my research is because welfare policy, one of the interesting things is that over time it became less about poverty and it became more about distinguishing who is deserving from who is undeserving. When government first took an interest in providing for people, it was white women who had to be widowed under very specific circumstances. If your husband deserted you, that's your problem. We're not here to assist you. You had to have been widowed or deserted or left in this position of no volition of your own. And within doing that, one of the things that's interesting when we look at social policies in the United States is as eligibility requirements begin to change, those stories start to change. So as Dr. Wright mentioned, the racist notion of Black criminality, the Moynihan Report of 1965. This is a report that came out that was supposed to get us a better understanding of races, of poverty. And what actually happened is that they looked at the social pathology of race, looking at many of these things that were happening because of individuals that were a byproduct, I will say, of individuals' station in life because of their social identity. And then we kind of ran with that and we created policies around these things and we began to intermingle these ideas. And so I think what we really need to do with social constructions is to begin to divest from these ideas. And in order to do that, we have to be very conscious about even the things that we take for granted, unsettling settled knowledge, asking questions and checking the assumptions that are laden in those questions.
I don't know how you did that in 3 minutes, but that was beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Stark. The reason for that question is so that we can all be thinking about public policy is actually based on stories that we tell, not truths. I want to do two things to start wrapping us up. I want to ask Dr. Sampson to help us understand this term that was used called intersectionality. And there are sort of intersectional identities and institutions that are intersecting. And I would like for you to sort of help us understand, how do we balance, keep our attention on them both? And then maybe all three of you can move towards, so here's some really clear next steps, and then we'll be wrapping up.
So that's a really big question in a couple of minutes, but I will say that the intersectionality of, when you think about, look back at the interlocking circles that I talked about, these things aren't separate from us. Our mental wellness, allyship, speaking up as needed, talking through these issues and labeling them. I have been in meetings when we are talking about inequities and nobody really knows what anybody's talking about, but people are afraid to share and say the words. So the institutional issues and then our own individual issues, they're all interlocking circles. And so if we're talking about centering the experiences of Black students, we got to center the experience of Native students. We've got to center experiences of LGBTQ students. We've got to look at our Asian brothers and sisters who've been getting the beat down since the pandemic. We've got to look at a lot of issues with a overarching lens that says inequities are not going to be tolerated anywhere. But it also may include skin tone. It might be people of size who are substantial. There are many areas that we have to pay attention to. It's just about making sure that when we see the inequity, we don't sit on it, we label it and call it out. A part of the harm is when we pretend that it's not there.
I don't know how you did listen. This is a really fascinating panel, and I know we're at time, but the fact that you all can communicate such beautiful, broad, important ideas in a concise amount of time speaks to your scholarship. And I appreciate that, and I want to acknowledge that. One of the comments in the chat was about next steps and action steps. So maybe each of you can take just a couple of seconds to give this group, those who can stick around for another minute or so, one or two things to begin doing. And I'll maybe ask Dr. Wright to start us off.
So what I have in mind is local community engagement. It's really simple. It doesn't only have to take the form of activism. Like, you don't have to wait until another tragic shooting of unarmed Black person to show up and yell and F the police and that sort of thing. Before the pandemic, because I'm relatively new to Denver, I moved here in 2014. I was trying to get to 2018, excuse me. I was trying to get to know the community. And so someone told me about a Reading Buddies program where you go to a school and every Friday you get together with youth there and you read books together with them. And it was enriching for me. I felt like I was giving back. It was also causing me to reflect on my own youth, but they're getting something out of it here. They're seeing someone who is an intellectual, who's well-read and is proud of it. Like, I'm proud of being a nerd, and is enjoying sitting down with them and reading some books. That is very powerful. That is something that you don't know what impact it will have on a youth's life decades from now. You really don't know. So it can be something as simple as that, just local community engagement in the simplest way possible.
Thank you for that, Dr. Wright. And I want to caveat that a little bit and say, for those of you who don't live in those communities, don't go and try and save anybody. Go and learn and serve. Don't save. Nobody's waiting on that. Dr. Stark.
Dr. Wright stole my thunder in terms of the overarching strategy, but I was going to just draw from a research study that was done a few years ago with a colleague of mine and I. In it, we looked at the role of local government. So one of the fascinating things, if you study federalism or or intergovernmental relationships within the United States, is that local governments are a creation of their state. They don't exist. They have no real authority outside of what their states allow. But what we found over time is that when you look at certain social issues, it is those local governments, those people who are working within their communities, that are making significant changes, that are becoming the innovation and the fusion that we need in government. So some of the examples that we looked at is, if you look at some of the broad spanning immigration policies, such as sanctuary cities, if you look at the everlasting ongoing ongoing fight for a minimum wage. Although a minimum wage is set at the federal level through the Department of Labor, these fights are fights that begin within communities, within workspaces, where you look at climate control and things of that nature. It's about what you're doing in your locus of control, looking at what's around you and how you can get involved. And I think that the best way that you can do that is by getting involved in government, getting involved in electoral politics. It's interesting the number of young, I consider myself relatively young, but young folks that I come in contact with, students who say that they, this is my first time talking politics. I don't enjoy talking politics. The experiences that they had with the 2016 election and things of that nature, that people really began to become disinterested in this work. And I think what's important is that we don't have to necessarily focus on the national level to begin to make change, that you can go into a room and change the narrative in that room where decisions are being made. And as Shirley Chisholm said, if they don't give you a chair, bring a folding chair. Like, come and be you, be unapologetic in that space, and don't allow these myths to perpetuate the social inequalities that we continue to see.
You're right. Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Stark. We can all show up and be engaged in our local government. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Dr. Sampson.
I want you to research the community agencies that are centering experiences of Black folks. Not only when you're going to vote your conscience, but put your money where your mouth is in terms of the community agencies that are struggling often to make sure that particularly youth are being supported. And you know what would be one small thing? Can you just not act as if Black folks are invisible? Can you speak to them? Can you say hello and acknowledge folks when they walk past you? Just start with that.
If you can't see us, how will you stand alongside us? I appreciate you all being with us this afternoon. I know we're 5 minutes over. I'll give it back to you tomorrow. I hope that this was a worthwhile conversation. I also want to encourage you, please don't just have listened in for an hour and then carry on with business as usual. If you're not thinking, what local community organizations can I serve? Who are my local elected officials and how do I connect with them? Who are the people in my community? Who are my neighbors that I may not have spoken to? This was a waste of your time. If it wasn't a waste of your time, think about how you can do things differently. I strongly encourage you to do that. And as Dr. King said famously, the moral arch of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I want to modify the word bend and say it is bent towards justice. These things don't happen naturally. And these three panelists, I think, are a really good example of how Black people have worked to bend the arc towards justice, because it's not coming for free. Thank you for your time. Have a really good Tuesday, and bye. Goodbye. Bye.